Well, good afternoon. It is great to be speaking to you again on another Thursday Thoughts video. My name is Simon. I'm one of the leaders and elders at Ascot Life Church, and we just wanted to make this series of videos because we suspect that many of us during this time may be asking those big questions that we don't usually ask. Questions about who God is, questions about who we are and what our role in this world is meant to be, questions about what Christianity is all about. And as I said last week, over last episode and the next two episodes, we're going to be asking one big question which we may have about Christianity, and that's, can I trust the Bible? The Bible is, of course, a very big component of the Christian life. You know, it's a good idea if you want to follow Jesus to know a bit about what he said, which is recorded in this book. But of course, there are a number of reasons why many of us may be hesitant to trust the Bible. And so, last week we looked at the question, is the Bible reliable? Is it an accurate report of what happened in history, or has it been falsified? Does it contain error? Does it even contain change that has happened over the centuries? So last week we looked at the Bible's reliability, but this week I want to ask the question, is the Bible relevant? Because even though we might admit that the Bible is an accurate and reliable report of history, we might still struggle to see how the Bible has any relevance for our lives today. Because the fact of the matter is, this book that I'm holding in my hand is thousands of years old. In fact, it was finished just under 2,000 years ago and started many centuries before that. And we know, don't we, that the world changes a lot in 2,000 years. I mean, to me, it feels like the world has changed a lot in the last 2 months, let alone the last 2 millennia. And so we might think, how could a book this old have any relevance to my life today? But we suspect the Bible's relevance, I think, not just because of its age, but also because of its outdated teachings. You know, we hear a lot of the teachings in the Bible, particularly teachings about sex and relationships maybe, and think they are so outdated. They're so outmoded. I mean, maybe you've heard some of what the Bible says about certain topics, and your response is to think that is just such an old school approach. That's such an ancient approach. And so we might think, how can a book that says those sorts of things have any relevance to my life today? We suspect that the Bible is irrelevant, not just because it's old, but also because some of its teachings come across to us as outdated and outmoded and irrelevant to our lives today. So that's really the question that I want to dig into this afternoon, is this. Is the Bible relevant, or is it an irrelevant and outdated book that I should leave alone? Well, it might not surprise you if you've watched a number of these videos to hear that I've got 3 main responses to that question. And the first reason that I think that the Bible is relevant to our lives today is because of the Bible's influence on the world around us. You know, whether we like it or not, it's hard to deny that the Bible has had a dramatic impact on the world around us. The Bible is, you may know, consistently the #1 bestseller in all of the book charts in the whole world. And this selling ability of the Bible is reflected in how much it has influenced all of the world. I just want to read a quote from Time magazine. One columnist says this about the Bible. He says this, simply put, the Bible is the most influential book of all time. The Bible has done more to shape literature, history, entertainment, and culture than any book ever written. Its influence on world history is unparalleled, and it shows no signs of abating. First reason I think the Bible is relevant is because it is unparalleled in its influence on the world and on world history. But not only is the Bible influential in a kind of general global sense, but the Bible is also hugely influential on each of us personally. You may not be aware of it, but the Bible has actually had a huge influence on how you see the world. You may remember that I talked about this a bit in episode 3, but the fact is that many of our deeply held and deeply cherished beliefs that we might consider to be self-evident, actually come to us through the influence of the Bible. I mean, take some of our kind of universally held beliefs that humans are of equal value, or belief that we should care for the poor and vulnerable, or the belief that even science can tell us about the world today. Do you know that all of these beliefs, which we might consider to be self-evident, actually come to us through the influence of this book? I'd love to read you another quote from this by actually a historian this time. You may know him, he's a popular historian called Tom Holland. He wouldn't call himself a Christian actually, but this is what he says about the influence of the Bible and Christianity. He says this: "Today, even as belief in God fades across the West, the countries that were once collectively known as Christendom continue to bear the stamp of the 2 millennia old revolution that Christianity represents. It is why, for instance, we generally assume that every human life is of equal value." So there is a non-Christian historian saying there, not just that the Bible has had a huge influence on the world around us, but it has also influenced each of us personally. The way we think, the way we see the world has been influenced deeply by this book, which suggests to me that it may have some relevant things and helpful things to say to us today. But even if we might accept that the Bible is an influential book, we might still resist reading the Bible because, as I said at the beginning, we see it as outdated. And this is particularly the case, as I said, with the Bible's teaching on sex and relationships. You may know that the Bible teaches that sex is meant for one couple in a marriage relationship. And of course, that teaching will strike many of us as very outdated. We may hear that and think, that is such a traditional way of looking at things. That is such an ancient view. And so on hearing that, we might say, why should I read this book? If this book says things which are so outdated and so contradictory to what I believe myself, why should I read what it says? But actually, this is actually the second reason why I think the Bible is relevant to us today, and it's precisely because it says things which contradict us. I think the fact that the Bible often says things we don't agree with doesn't make it an irrelevant book. I think that's precisely what makes it relevant to us today. I mean, just imagine if you were today to pick up the Bible and you were to start at page 1 and cycle all the way through to the end of the Bible. And if you found that on every single page it only ever said things that you agree with. If you read through the whole Bible and found that you agreed with it on every single point. Now, I don't know about you, but if that happened to me, I would find that quite suspicious. If that was my experience of reading the Bible, my conclusion would be not that this is some amazing book that everyone should read, but that this is a book just written by another human to please another human like me. If the Bible agreed with me in every sense, I would struggle to believe that this had come from God. But on the other hand, if, as is often the case for us, I read through the Bible and it sometimes agreed with me and sometimes contradicted me, then I would be more likely to assume that actually I'm reading something real. I'm not reading something made up, but I'm reading something from a God who is revealing himself. Because if you think about it, if there is a perfect God who exists and has chosen to reveal himself through this book to imperfect humans, shouldn't we expect that at some point it will challenge us? If God is perfect and we are not, when we read his word, we should expect it to sometimes say things which we struggle to agree with. And actually, this has been the case for every single person and every single culture that has ever grappled with the Bible. You know, the truth is, the Bible contradicts every single culture that has ever existed. You know, again, in our case, the way this happens is obvious. You know, when our cultures and cultures like ours read the Bible, we are offended at the Bible's teachings on sex and relationships. But, you know, in a different way, when the Bible talks about human equality and inclusion and welcome of everyone and tolerance, we love that stuff. We accept it. The Bible contradicts us on the sex bit, but on the equality bit, we love that. We lap that up. But if you look at another culture, perhaps a culture that is more conservative, more traditional, maybe a more ancient or medieval culture, that culture would read the Bible's instructions on sex and find them helpful, wise, right. But then when the Bible starts talking about radical equality, radical inclusion of everyone, even your enemies, then that's where that culture would be offended. The fact is, the Bible offends and contradicts every culture and every person on different places. And surely that is exactly what we would expect if this book has come to us not just from a human, not just from a group of men trying to create a conspiracy, but it's come to us from a perfect God who is revealing himself to imperfect humans. So that's the second reason I think the Bible is relevant to us, and it's because it contradicts us. The Bible, because it says things which sometimes aren't plain to us, which contradict our beliefs, I think that suggests to us that the Bible is more than just a human book and has relevant things to say to us in our world today. And actually, just before I move on to our third point, I do want to grapple with the question about the Bible's view of sex for just a minute or two. And I want to consider the fact that maybe the Bible's views on sex and relationships actually aren't that outdated. Because, after all, the belief that everyone should be able to freely enjoy sex however they want, that is not a new belief. That belief did not arise in the 1960s with the sexual revolution. That is, in fact, a very ancient belief. In the classical world, that is how people viewed sex. Particularly if you were a wealthy, aristocratic male, it was believed that you could have sex however you want, with whoever you want, whenever you want. No, when the Bible came along and had a more committed view of sex to be had in marriage only, that was not an outdated belief. No, that was a very new belief. It was very novel. It was radical for the Christians to come along and say that. And actually, there is evidence to suggest that this way of viewing sex and relationships actually helps us to flourish. You know, there's a book called A Better Story by an author named Glyn Harrison. And this man is a former professor of psychiatry at the University of Bristol. And in this book, he talks about the sexual revolution. And he says about how it's been sold as this incredible liberating and freeing phenomenon for many people. But then he gives data to suggest that how actually this isn't the case. He says that whilst it's been sold as this liberating moment for humanity and for people in the West, actually what it's led to is a lot of harm to human beings. It turns out that removing commitment from relationships makes us less fulfilled in our romantic relationships, less fulfilled in our general friendships and that sort of thing. There's also data to suggest that it makes us more lonely, and also that it harms children when marriage isn't practiced in society. Now, of course, that was a very brief response, and you could debate all of those points, but I think there is evidence and data to suggest that the Bible's teaching on sex and marriage actually isn't outdated, it isn't unhelpful, but actually might help us flourish as human beings. So that's the second reason why I think the Bible is relevant, because it gives us advice that may contradict us, but is actually wise and helps us flourish as human beings. But moving on to my third point now, I don't want to leave us with the impression that the Bible is relevant mostly because it just gives wise advice and gives good counsel to us. Of course, I believe that's true. But I think the main reason the Bible is relevant to us is not because it just gives good wisdom for practicing life, but it's because it tells a true story of the world we live in. The Bible ultimately is not a manual for life. The Bible, at its most basic, is not simply a list of do's and don'ts. At its most basic, the nature of the Bible is that of a story. That is what the Bible presents itself as. It presents itself as telling a story. It actually claims to tell the true story of the whole world. And the story of the Bible is that there was a creator God who created everything. In love, he made the world and everything in it. And he also made human beings, us, in his image to rule the world on his behalf and rule it for him and with him. But then, after human beings make a mess of this world and reject God and ruin his creation, the Bible's story then turns to how God is going to restore his creation back to its intention, about how he's going to restore human beings to who they're meant to be and restore the world to its original perfection. And this ultimately comes to a climax in God sending his son Jesus into the world, who lived a perfect life and then died so that we should know forgiveness. And after that he rose again so that we could know new life. And the Bible tells us that sometime coming he is going to return to this earth and renew all things, set them back to their perfect original intention. That is the ultimate message of the Bible. It's not about telling you what you can do and what you can't do. No, it's telling you the story of the world you live in. And it's not hard to see that this story is very relevant to us today. It's relevant not just because it tells us and explains the world around us, but also because it gives us answers to those deepest longings, those deep questions we find ourselves asking. One question you may often ask is, who am I? Do I have value? Do I have worth? The Bible's answer to that is, yes, you do. Because you're not here just because of a random collision of chemicals. You're here because God created you in his image. And he loved you so much that he sent his son to die for you. Another question we might find ourselves asking is, what's my life's purpose? What am I here for? The Bible tells you that you're here to glorify him. You're here to rule the world on his behalf and extend his goodness and beauty to every inch of this world and this universe. And thirdly, another question we might find ourselves asking, particularly at this time, is how is everything going to be made right? Can I have hope in life? Can I have hope that all things will be put right? And the Bible says, if you know Jesus, yes you can. Because one day he's coming to restore this whole world, and he longs to restore you with that too. This is ultimately why I think the Bible is relevant to us today. Not just because it has had influence on world history, and not just because it has wise teachings and advice for us today, though of course it does, and I believe that very much. But ultimately, I think the Bible is relevant to us today because it tells us the true story of the world we live in and invites us to come and play our role, our part in that story. And if you would like to find out more about what it means to know God and know Jesus and live in this story that he is writing, we would love to invite you to come and join us on Sundays. We live stream our Sunday services at 10 a.m. and at 6 p.m. You'd be more than welcome to join us on Facebook or YouTube or just through our website. Another thing you could do is you could email me on simon@ascotlife.church, and I'd love to take any questions, maybe a question that you'd like answered in one of these videos. I'd be happy to take requests in that way. But another thing you could do, of course, is tune in next week to our next Thursday Thoughts, where we're going to be looking finally at the Bible and asking the question, is it moral? Well, I hope that's been helpful and looking forward to speaking to you sometime soon. Thanks.